sometimes you can't fix the situation, and all you can fix is your focus. Paul said, right now, all I see is a ship going down, and I know that's all you see, and I know that's all you can think about, and I know that's all you can focus on. But last night, I saw an angel. I'm not looking at what I'm going through right now. I'm looking toward my future, and I'm looking back at what God spoke to me in my past, and so my focus is fixed. We always want God to stop the storm. Sometimes He doesn't. Sometimes what He wants to teach you to do is to fix your focus in the middle of the storm. I want to preach to you today on the subject of fear. And I don't want to just stay at a surface level. I want to preach a message about facing your fear, about how to feel fear in your life, your heart, your mind, and what to do about that. Today our text will be from Acts chapter 27. In this passage, the Apostle Paul is in trouble. He's going through a storm, and he has to decide what voice he will believe about the storm he's going through. Thesis for the series and the book, the voice you believe will determine the future that you experience and the way you experience your reality. And we're gonna pick up right in the middle of Paul's problem in Acts 27, verse 9. The winds are starting to blow contrary. The sailors are having a difficult time. Paul is on board a ship with 275 other prisoners. And there must be a part of him that can't believe he's facing prison again. He's got to go stand trial before Caesar. He's not on a cruise ship. He's in Royal Caribbean. He's not headed to Rome because he always thought it would be nice. He's not tasting wine. He's chained as a prisoner. And if that wasn't bad enough, he's now got to face a storm on that ship. And this is where we begin in verse 9. It says, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, the other men on the ship, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But the centurion, he's the guy who was in charge of transporting the prisoners, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Now, I wrote down in my notes, of course he did. That makes sense. If you've got to make a sailing decision, it makes sense to ask the pilot of the ship, not the preacher who happens to be on the ship. Sometimes preachers think they know everything. And so Paul's given advice about where to steer the ship, and they ignore his advice, and they pay for it, because on this ship, Paul doesn't just represent a preacher or just a prisoner, but he actually represents the purpose of God and the voice of God. And so when he speaks about, hey, we're gonna be in trouble if we keep going this direction, he's warning them on behalf of God. I wanna give you 3 things, and I'd like you to write these down. They'll be here on the teaching screen. Do you like this little screen I use, or is it kind of cheesy? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out if I like it. But sometimes I like to do it. Just mix it up. Keep you guessing. Will there be a screen? Will there not? You never know. Story at 11. All right, so I wanted to tell you today that when you find yourself in a storm, and you will, steer by the Spirit, not by your senses. Steer by the Spirit and not by your senses. And it's so easy to steer by your senses because we're trained to walk by what we see. And we're trained in so many ways to respond to what we feel. God will warn you, but He will never create worry within you. When God warns you, He'll give you a specific instruction, and it'll mobilize you and make you stronger. When the enemy threatens you, he won't make you stronger, he'll make your faith weaker. When God instructs you, he'll give you a specific warning. He'll show you something, maybe through someone, maybe through his spirit, maybe through his word, and he'll show you something you need to correct. The enemy will never do that. He'll just threaten you in a vague way until you can't even figure out what's wrong, but you just find yourself up at night, worried about things. When I talk about fear, I'm not just talking about the big fears that we all face. I'm talking about just that sense of anxiety that we learn to live with as if it's normal. That sense of dread that we just learn to carry around with us and drag behind us and just, go through life kind of worried about what they'll think and worried about what they'll say and worried about if I fail and worried about if I succeed. If I succeed, there's more pressure. If I fail, they're all gonna laugh at me, and just going through life afraid, just going through life nervous, just nervous when things are going good, because if things are going good, it can't be long. What goes up must come down. I'm just worried, I'm just scared, I'm just anxious. And so God gives a warning that is ignored. I need to tell you that when you ignore God's warnings, you will always suffer loss. How many of you will testify? Be real enough to raise your hand and say, I have ignored some warnings before that God was trying to give me, and I suffered loss. Yeah. I'm not going to preach about that, but I want to point it out because your life is being steered by something. Are you being steered like these men on the ship by what you can see? They had their nautical maps spread out. They knew how to sail. They thought they knew exactly what they were doing and where they were going. But we walk by faith, not by sight. And if you steer your life by your senses, you'll end up in trouble. If you send emails based on what you feel in the moment, you end up in trouble. Save the text and see if you still want to send it tomorrow. I can't tell you how many texts I've written that I never sent. Because I'll be steering by my feelings, see? But your feelings can't forecast the future. Only God's Spirit can. And so you got to learn how to steer by the Spirit. Isn't that good? Wouldn't that save us a lot of time and trouble? It sure would. And so they ignore Paul's advice. Instead of hearing God's voice above all others, they hear all other voices above God's. The voice you respond to will determine the future you experience. Are you steering by your senses, or are you steering by the Spirit? Well, Paul was right. They kept sailing along. They refused to stop. And verse 14 picks up, says, before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. That phrase is so descriptive, driven along. That's how a lot of us live our lives, driven along. When a thought of panic comes, we just go with it. When a thought of worry comes, we just go with it. When a fear of rejection comes, we just clam up and we just go with it. The scripture says that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but power, love, and a sound mind. We'll talk about that verse at the very end of the sermon, time permitting. But for right now, I wanted to speak to somebody who's being driven along by the winds and the waves of your life, by the feelings and emotions of fear, by the thoughts of anxiety that are keeping you up at night. Have you so nervous, you're playing out scenarios over and over again in your mind, just driven along. You can't even function correctly. You can't even give yourself fully to the people who are all around you who love you because you're so worried about losing them that you can't even interact with them. You're driven along by a spirit of fear. You're driven along through life. You don't really have an anchor in anything, just driven along and just always watching out for what's gonna happen next. There's a fine line between precaution and paranoia, and some of us are crossing it. We've just been driven along because the winds are contrary. And so it says they were driven along by the winds and the waves. Verse 16. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. Everything's unstable. Life feels that way sometimes. So the men hoisted it aboard, and then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. They just let it be driven along. Just now it's at the point where there's nothing we can do. It's just gone. It's just, the situation is beyond our control. So verse 18, we took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Now they're wasting supplies and wasting money, all in an effort to lighten the ship so they can somehow save it. Verse 19, on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And verse 20, to me, is very poignant in describing fear's ultimate goal in our lives. If we let it go unchecked and drive us along, it will eventually come to this point. Luke, who is recording the book of Acts, says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging. When the storm continued raging. So when the trouble first started, we were okay. We were doing what we could do. We were anxious, but we were still active. But now it's gotten so bad, we can't see any signs. We can't see any stars. We don't know what to guide by. It's gotten really dark. And when it got to that point, it says, that we finally gave up all hope of being saved. We gave up all hope. Now we've gone from despair to depression. They say that the clinical definition of depression, if you study people who are truly depressed, is that they have given up hope that they will ever feel any different than they do right now. Given up hope that life will ever be any different than it is right now. Luke says, that's how bad it was. We couldn't see anything. What we were guiding by got lost, and so our hope was gone. We gave up all hope. And I'm speaking to somebody today, God knows who you are, who has become hopeless. Hopeless. That you're ever going to progress past this fear, that you're ever going to change from this state that you're in. It was one thing when you could see the star to guide you by, but now that you're in a storm and you have no star, you've lost your hope. You see it, he said, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. But you know, Luke is writing Acts 27. He's the one recording it. But Paul is the main character of the story. And so I gotta imagine if Paul was reading, you know, Acts chapter 27 that Luke wrote, we gave up all hope of being saved. He'd say, wait a minute. What you mean we? What you mean we? Because see, everybody else has given up hope of being saved. They've completely capitulated to fear. And yet in the midst of all of these voices, don't you know they were all freaking out? We're going down on this ship and I don't even deserve to be a prisoner and it ain't fair and I didn't even do it and I had an alibi and I wasn't even there. And they're all talking about loss and despair. And then Paul speaks up. You're gonna love this, verse 21. It says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, this guy, men, you should have taken my advice. And some of you are very confused. You're thinking, I didn't know Paul was a woman. Wait for it. No, I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. Holly said she was going to get that verse printed. She said, that's my new life verse. Men, you should have taken my advice. Wouldn't that make a great Mother's Day sermon? Men, you should have. Okay, I'm going to move on from that. I felt some hostility. 50% of my love just left the room. Let's see if I can get back. Men, you should have taken my advice. I told you so. You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now, I love those two words. I wanted to point out the context of the conflict in this passage, because it's one thing to believe that God will get you out of a storm if he put you in the storm. But don't a lot of our fears come from believing that we got ourselves into this mess and now we can't depend on God to get us out? Like if God lets me be thrown in the lion's den, okay. God's gonna shut the mouths of the lion. I read that he could do it. If God sends me into a storm and I was just obeying him, but what about if it was my fault? And that's where real fear kicks in. It's one thing to believe that God will do it. He will deliver you. He will save you if you know He's the one who brought you here. But what about if I lost my job because I was lazy? You don't have to tell anybody else. You can stick to your story about how the boss didn't like you. But what if you know deep down in your heart that you could have done more to keep your job? And so now you're unemployed and you know that you're at least part of the cause for why you lost your job. Now will God do it? What about if your relationship is on the ropes because you weren't as loving and tender as you could have been? What about if you were a little neglectful? See, it's not just the predicaments that God gets me into that I'm worried, will He get me out? There's some stuff I get my own self into sometimes, and then I get afraid, well, I guess since I got myself into this, I got to get myself out. So you'd be surprised how much of our fear is based in regret. That something that I did or didn't do is now catching up with me. And so now I'm out here on my own. But Paul says in verse 22, put it back on the screen, he said, but now, if I had time, I'd take the rest of today and talk about living in now. How Hebrews says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So when you can't see the stars, come on somebody, and when you've lost all hope, God says, but now. Yeah, there are some things you could have done differently. Yeah, there's some contributions that you made to this conflict, but now, somebody shout now. Come on, shout it in the top of the room, say now. Can't change what I didn't do. Can't change what I should have done. Can't complete what I left unfinished. Some things are just the way they are, but now. He said, but now. Well, put the verse back up. I don't remember what he says next. I urge you. Oh, here it is. It's good. To keep up your courage. That's part of my second point. I want to tell you number 2. There's only 3. We're making excellent time. Fix your focus and keep up your courage. Fix your focus and keep up your courage. Touch somebody next to you as soon as you're done writing down that point and say, keep it up. Keep it up. Keep it up. Come on, if you're still writing, elbow them and tell them, keep it up. Right there in the ribs. Keep it up. Fix your focus. Now, Paul goes on to say, keep up your courage because, let's look at the verse, not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. There's good news and there's bad news. About this boat, ain't looking too good for the boat. But keep up your courage because we're going to make it. God told me so. Keep going. Next verse. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong, I know who I am and I know whose I am, and whom I serve, stood beside me. I'm glad he doesn't just go before me or behind me, but he stands right by me in the midst of trouble. He's a multi-directional, omnidirectional God. He's a 360 God. He doesn't change positions like, I better get back. He just got you. He said he stood beside me. I'm getting happy preaching this to myself. Sometimes I don't even need you here to preach. I'm just preaching to me. He said, don't be afraid, Paul. This is what the angel told him. He said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. In other words, I'm not focused on the storm I see right now. I'm focused on the future that God has promised me. So he says, don't be afraid, Paul. 25. So keep up your courage, men. Keep up your courage. For I have faith in God, here's my title, that it will happen. Woo. It will happen. Just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. The ship's going down, but keep your courage up. How do you keep your courage up when the ship's going down? It's the essence of faith. You have to learn to separate out your courage from your conditions. See, if your courage is tied to your conditions, when your bank account goes down, your courage goes down with it. If your courage is tied to your conditions, when a certain relationship in your life starts going down, your courage goes down with it. How do you keep up your courage? Apparently, even when my conditions are outside of my control, my courage is never outside of my control. Your courage is under your control. He didn't say God's gonna keep up your courage. So stop praying, God give me courage. Because he's gonna say, I gave it to you, now keep it up. Keep it up, feed it. You've been feeding your fears, and now they're eating you alive. And you've been surveying your conditions, and you've lost all hope. But Paul said, fix your focus. See, sometimes you can't fix the situation, and all you can fix is your focus. Paul said, right now, all I see is a ship going down. And I know that's all you see. And I know that's all you can think about. And I know that's all you can focus on. But last night, I saw an angel. I'm not looking at what I'm going through right now. I'm looking toward my future. And I'm looking back at what God spoke to me in my past. And so my focus is fixed. We always want God to stop the storm. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes what he wants to teach you to do is to fix your focus in the middle of the storm. Is this not what we see with Peter? Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come. Come. Peter starts walking. The wind starts blowing. As long as Peter looked at Jesus, Peter was fine. When he looked at the wind and the waves, what's that? Focus. When he started thinking about how rough it is out here, let me ask you a question. Was Peter any more able to walk on water if it hadn't been raining than if it was? If the winds hadn't been strong? Is he any more able to walk on water if the conditions had been clear? It's not about the conditions. It's about your courage. You can walk through stuff and live through stuff and be brave through stuff. I've met people who were dying and knew they had 3 days to live, who were bolder than most of us who are gonna live for 70 more. Why? They weren't focused on the fear. I'm gonna teach you a trick. Your fear is powered by your focus. If you take the focus away from the fear and put your focus on your faith, faith is also powered by focus. So you don't need God to stop the storm for you to get your courage up. You don't need God to fix the ship for your courage to come up. You just need to fix your eyes on what? On Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame. When you give power to fear and anxiety in your mind, it always drags you down. It never ends well. What you need is a plan to learn what to do when those voices start talking to you, telling you you're not gonna make it, you've seen your best days already,
right.
Nobody is with you, and this is your practical plan.
Yeah, we all have those negative thoughts and those negative emotions, but having a plan to deal with the negative emotions instead of trying to ignore them. I think for me, a lot of times I've learned that when I try to ignore those negative thoughts, it actually makes them more powerful. Anxiety and stress and worry begins to build up, and then once again, they start to gain momentum in my mind, and it can be really hard to shut them down.
It can seem impossible to shut them down. But it's not impossible,
right.
Not if you know what to do when
Exactly.
anxiety comes your way. So I want to get some tools in your hand to help you know what to do. Maybe even we could call them weapons to fight back when anxiety attacks, to stand strong in the middle of any storm.
Yeah.
You can learn to have steady faith. You don't always have to be up and down with what happens to you. When everything around you is shaking, there is something stable to stand on. I want you to go online or call the number on your screen and do it now so you can receive When Anxiety Attacks with your gift today.
Yeah.
This series includes some of my favorite sermons, and not just mine, the ones that we've received the most feedback about, where people write in and say, I was dealing with fear, crippling fear.
Yeah.
I was dealing with everyday dread. Anxiety just came crashing over me like a wave.
Yep.
And then God spoke to me and showed me what to do, and it's making a real difference in my life. Trust me when I say, you gotta get your hands on this resource.
So helpful. It's
Here-
gonna help you.
I hope so, and I believe so. Here are some more details about today's offer.
The devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. You're underperforming. Your boss doesn't like you because you're not doing a very good job. You don't have what it takes. You are shaky at best. I am not enough. You're gonna fail. Run, because that's the only advice when you're faced with the roaring lion. The winds and the waves are roaring and raging, feeling all alone, freaking out. This is it. This is a time for resistance. He is a lion, and he might be licking his lips, and his fangs might be sharp, and he might have you in his sight, and you might have failed, and you might have done it, and you might be going down. But you need to know one thing about this lion. The lion is on a leash. He can only go so far. He can only do so much. He can't keep you down forever. This is it. Anxiety stops here. Depression stops here. Fear stops here. The name of Jesus is higher. You have all power in your hand.
Don't endure anxiety without a plan to deal with the attacks when they come. Receive your copy of When Anxiety Attacks today.